we come to our last but certainly not least topic today, menopause and employment, the law. So it's going to be a legal presentation delivered by Yvonne Gallagher. She's a partner in the law firm Harbattle and Lewis with impressive practice in advising senior executive dispute and complexity moves. She works with clients from a wide range of industry sectors, including financial services, technology, media, and support services. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yes, we can. We can see the slides as well.
You can see my slides. Good. Let me just get those up to full size for you. And I'm a very different topic from my predecessor, but I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak today. So my topic, menopause and employment, a look at the law. My aim really is just to cover where the growing debate around how employers in particular should consider menopause, what the law is doing, whether we are moving to a time where there is greater consideration to be given now to the issues that this period of time in the life of female employees may actually need to be spoken about more openly and dealt with a degree more formality and consciousness than has been the case in the past. I'm going to consider the position as I understand it, really internationally, because a number of countries are edging towards the same place. But in terms of the details, I will focus on the UK in terms of numbers and examples, because there's some useful specifics there that obviously I am most familiar with, that do perhaps enlighten the approach more broadly. So the first thing to think about here is actually what's the scale of this? And just to look at the UK on a broad brush approach, if we take the 45 to 55 age group as the core of this issue, and we may argue that most certainly it needs to include a young cohort who find themselves in this position unexpectedly early as a result of either illness or surgery or other factors, and the fact that in some cases it may be later. We're talking 5 million women, which in the UK workforce, which is getting on for 17-18% of our economically active workforce at any time, so a significant number. And we are also told, now I can't exactly vouch for these statistics because the reasons people resign really won't always be known or truthfully stated, but 1 million a year in this cohort resign every year. You would understand that that's potentially a very significant loss of resource, it's a loss of experience, and it's a loss of corporate memory for organisations. And while there may be any number of reasons for this, to the extent that the period of life largely captured within the term menopause and the symptoms that come with it are part of the problem, then this may be something that employers will wish to address as part of ensuring that they're not losing valuable people for reasons which could actually be addressed and ameliorated for what is, after all, a temporary period in the life of the individual going through the process. So looking now at what is happening worldwide, I haven't been able to trace any evidence that any country has got as far as specific legislation. If anyone knows differently, I'd be very glad to hear it. But there is much more talking about it. The UK, Australia and the US all have various working parties, committees, lobby groups, discussions, things that might typically preface an arrival of legislation further down the line. In the UK, as well as various lobby groups, our Parliament itself has set up its own committee to look at the impact of this and to see if legislation is something that would be appropriate to deal with the issue. So far, there has been a public consultation on the issue, which is very recently closed. So we haven't yet had a report of their findings, but there were apparently a high number of submissions to that addressing the issue. In terms of, as employers, how might we look at this issue? Where might employment law come into play? So our current framework across most countries will be that there may be some level of protection from dismissal, and if an individual found themselves actually dismissed because, for example, their performance deteriorated during a period of severe symptoms, or their ability to be present in the office or to work the lengthy hours they may have worked at younger stages. If those sorts of things led ultimately to a dismissal, then most countries would have some form of claim for that termination. And in the UK, like many others, the employer would need to show what was the reason for the termination, and then that termination was a reasonable act on the part of the employer. If we are talking dismissing somebody expressly because they are suffering menopause symptoms, then we would all see that possibly looks something the courts will find unfair. But of course, the practical point, and it comes through all of these themes, is that the employer won't necessarily identify the issue, and the female member of staff may be reluctant to do so, maybe even reluctant to acknowledge to themselves that their performance is not what it used to be, or that they are less effective than one time they were. If we look at what are typically recorded as the key symptoms, as well as the things everybody's heard of, hot flushes, and obviously the ending of menstruation, which some people will find a bonus, I'm sure. A level of poorer concentration, brain fog, forgetfulness, those kinds of things are frequently identified as potential symptoms. And clearly those will have potentially a very serious impact on performance. And if a role is one where absolute accuracy and attention to detail and focus is required, we can all see that there may be conflicts between the needs of the job and the ability to avoid a termination. The other area legally to explore is what's the position under general discrimination law. Across the EU nations, there will be a broadly similar range of protections afforded, and the UK is still respecting those despite our move out of the EU. And the relevant features here would appear to be the protections for discrimination on grounds of sex, age and disability. The sex, obviously, this is something that affects female employees only. One hears talk of a male menopause, but whatever that may be, it's certainly not the same item biologically, given the ending of reproductive years and so on for the females. Age is clearly potentially relevant because this largely affects women within that 45 to 55 sort of space. And then the final thing that is sometimes argued is whether those years might count an individual with particularly severe symptoms as falling within the remit of disability discrimination protection. Again, the form that takes generally is to define disability and then require employers not just to not discriminate or treat less favourably on the grounds of the disability, but potentially to make positive adjustments to working arrangements to allow the individual to continue to perform. And in this context, that might be around working hours, some reallocation of duties, as basic a thing as provision of suitable fans or air conditioning if body temperature and flushes and so on are a real issue. There are problems and gaps with all of these. On the last point, disability, I don't think it is unreasonable to anticipate that it's not a tremendously attractive option for women seeking the protection of the law to have characterised themselves as suffering a disability for what is in fact an entirely normal physiological process in most cases. And the characterisation as disability may feel negative and unattractive. It possibly also brings with it, in some regimes, a question mark about actually what obligation, if you characterise yourself as disabled, what obligation do you have to avail of all possible treatments or medications in order to ameliorate those symptoms? And in this context, the medication in the form of hormone replacement therapies and so on would come up. Would it ever feel appropriate for an employer to ask a female employee in this cohort whether she either is taking such treatments or has considered it, or does that feel like it's precisely none of the employer's business? These kind of conversations start to take us into areas that we may simply not be comfortable with. And as I flagged previously on the age side, we can't just assume that the core band is the only group protected, because there will be people outside that band. Equally, as with any characteristics, assumptions should not be made about whether an individual is in fact dealing with these sorts of issues simply because they land in a particular age category. In terms of what's actually happening, we see that some companies, the bigger ones, typically those very well resourced with large-scale HR teams and so on, are starting to put in place positive policies. Those policies are designed primarily to support women who are encountering difficulties at this stage of life. But they serve also another function, which is really around awareness raising and an attempt to banish some of the embarrassment that comes with discussion of issues relating to bodies and age and what might be regarded as quite private functions by some people who will be reluctant to dismiss. And it does seem that must be a useful state of affairs, though I come on in a moment to the fact that no advance is without some risk either. But we are starting to see more awareness, certainly much more discussion in news and media, which tends to lead to more awareness in the workplace of what may or may not be happening. I've looked at what we have in case law in the UK and more broadly. And what we see is that at sort of the first level of decisions, so the first employment court that an individual might go to if they felt there was an issue, there is receptiveness on the part of court judges to accept that there may be issues here and that individuals before them may have been unfairly treated because of menopause issues that they were dealing with at the time. They have recognised in some cases that an individual may have been a victim of age discrimination. They have recognised that there may be sex discrimination, and they have in some cases accepted that menopause-related symptoms may qualify as a disability. So we can see, as a matter of fact, in individual cases, they are already alive to these issues and willing to make appropriate findings to protect individuals where the facts would tend to suggest that there has been some disadvantage on those grounds. On the broader dismissal side, again, a willingness to see that if an individual recognises and characterises the issues that they are facing as being this problem, and the employer is unwilling to make any adjustment at all, despite perhaps potentially many years of very professional and successful service, then that is likely to give rise to risk of unfair dismissal claims, and the tribunals will find a lack of willingness to engage with the topic if it's raised by female employees as a potentially unfair state of affairs. But we come back to the fact that a level of this requires that all the parties even recognise what they're dealing with and feel able to have the conversations, and the reluctance and embarrassment can be on both sides of the table in this context. Thinking about the way ahead, it's the campaign groups tend to lobby pretty vociferously for change and recognition, but we do all need to think about what might be workable, what might be valued and appreciated by employers and by those that the campaigners are looking to protect. So in terms of what's workable, I would say any legislation needs to recognise that employers do want work done to a proper standard, and that is not an unreasonable thing to require. So it may be that if a period of support or adjustment is needed, that needs to be in the sense of allowing perhaps reallocation of some duties or different working hours or slightly different focus or conditions to deal with the issues. I don't think we will ever see a point, though media will doubtless suggest otherwise, where employers are required to accept a performance below par in critical areas and can do nothing about it. There will be balance in there, and there will be recognition of the needs of the employer. So in terms of what's needed, openness and willingness to engage with difficult topics as ever is useful. I think a lot of workplace disputes and subsequent claims in practice come out of a failure to address the real subject matter and to have difficult conversations, and doubtless awareness raising and a level of training perhaps about how to start a conversation on a subject that feels personal and perhaps a little bit embarrassing for everybody would be useful. It's always good to think about what are the risks if you make changes, and it strikes me that there are risks for women in a campaign to bring a more formal level of menopause protection to the table. The biggest risk is, if I can put it crudely, to create yet another reason not to employ the woman candidate. We will all be familiar with tales of actually, I recruited somebody and the next thing I knew they were pregnant. So I really don't want to recruit any young women again, because they'll only go off and have babies and want to work part-time or not to come back, and I can't manage all of that. Probably unhelpful to women in the workforce if this is perceived as a further. There's a slight irony, isn't there, of, well, I don't want to recruit women in reproductive years, so I'll go for the older ones because they're job done on that. Oh no, here's something that's going to stop me employing those two because I won't be able to deal with any problems. I think there is scope for real prejudice there, and any changes need to recognise that employers are entitled to manage workforces and require appropriate levels of performance and so on. Obviously, there's a risk that once you change the law to give a specific right, there's a greater risk to employers of claims, whether well-founded or not, that come out of that, and it's right to acknowledge that as a risk here. The risk of no change is in part that we allow problems to continue. I've identified that there is a significant loss of workforce during these years, Most developed countries are in a demographic now where the pyramid, if you like, is narrow at the bottom. The young people coming into the workforce are not coming in numbers enough to replace those who are stepping out at the top end. And demographic time bombs and all the rest of that would tend to lead to the conclusion that prolonging the economically active lifetime of the working population is productive both for employers and for economies and the globe as a whole. If changes aren't made, we continue as we are, shedding large parts of workforces. Perhaps also, and a little unexpectedly, if there is recognition and more understanding that, yes, that there are absolutely physiological symptoms, things that cause problems, things that will impact on work, but they don't last forever. And the female cohort who have emerged through the other side of this period of change actually often report greater confidence, less need to worry about other people's opinion, a level of boldness and courage that wasn't there previously, and a potentially lengthy number of years of working life ahead of them, all of which can potentially be of value to employers as well as the individuals if all of this is managed properly. So that brings me to a close. I'll be very glad to answer any questions or hear any opinions if anyone has any.
Thank you very much. Before we see if we have some questions to the audience, I would like to, I admire especially what you say, losing menopausal woman is losing corporate memory, right? Mm-hmm. And I will remember that. But it's nice to see that there is a debate. There are cases already, yeah, especially in a case law system like British. Is there any discussion or anything about the andropause? Because we have another 50% from the population. I don't want to dilute the focus, but it's curiosity there.
It's a very good point to raise, and I would say almost none. And in some respects, perhaps worse than none, because the way in which the andropause will be referred to is the male menopause, and the stereotype of that will be run off with a younger woman by a fast car rather than any more serious engagement, that there may be similar loss of confidence, loss of a sense of being part of groups in workforces. How actually do we deal with a range of ages in a workplace and make everybody feel productive and welcome? But I think this is one for the men to lead their campaign on, and I'm not seeing it happen so far.
Because at the moment upstairs where I am, we have a professor in andropause, and he's seeing patients, and the way they get subscribed is a very special way. It's if a woman gets an appointment for menopause question, they go straight. It's okay. But when we deal with potential andropause, that's a lot of a clandestine approach. You have to be much more attentive. So from purely medical point of view, this is even not on the table as a debate, but
that's interesting. And I think we would generally see across many developed countries men much more reluctant to engage with medical issues, much fewer visits to doctors, presenting themselves when the condition is very severe rather than in early stages. And that probably feeds into the whole reaction, doesn't it?
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience?
If I may add a question myself, just to tie everything to today's topic, which is patient advocacy. I was wondering if there are any advocacy groups, to your knowledge, in the UK or worldwide that are actually focusing on this topic.
Yes, there are. There are a number. Off the top of my head, I couldn't name them, but there certainly are. And aiming to get recognition that there are issues that need to be engaged with, and that the medical profession needs to take them seriously and perhaps individualise care a little more, rather than assume it's a one-size-fits-all, here's the prescription, away you go.
Thank you.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate.
We hope to see you next year as well.
I'll be very glad.
And then we can embed a little bit the discussion about undergoes.
Yes.
If you don't mind.
I might not be the best speaker on that one, but very happy to contribute.
About the advocacy group, I'm aware of one in Sweden. I will drill down in my files to provide you with it. They even have a database, which is very, very good. They just provide data from their own database, and the data are very, very robust.
Data is the key to all of it, isn't it?
Data, medical data about the number and type of fractures, and any other adverse events, and yeah, they're really very advanced. So remind me, I'll find it. I'll find the details.
Very interesting.
Thank you for the very interesting and insightful contribution.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. I hope the conference has been a great success.
So far, yeah, it's very, very
good.
Very good success.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.